1850. Let's go back to 2,000 years ago. That's only 2100s. It's only 20 centuries ago. For me, that's only about 80 people ago. 80 people ago. So, when we think about time, let's think about it that way. 2,000 years ago, some of my ancestors, about 80 people ago. See, there's more than 80 of us here in this audience. 2,000 years ago, people with disabilities, born with disabilities, infants were simply tossed in the river. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You all know that. People with disabilities had horrific circumstances throughout history. Come up about 1,000 years ago, people only considered us to be demon-possessed and locked away in asylums and institutions, more horrible, horrible places. There was one fellow around about 1200 AD, Mr. Thomas, worked in one of these institutions, and he continued to advocate. They didn't call it that back then, but he continued to approach the authorities of the institution, describing the inhumane treatment that was put upon these people every day, and advocated for human rights, advocated for better treatment. Well, Mr. Thomas didn't get very far, and he finally became so frustrated and enraged that, of course, he worked at the institution. He just went in one day and opened up all the doors, unlocked everybody, and let all the people out on the community. Got their attention. Got the people's attention and authority. We come on up another 1,000 years, and I'm getting closer to winding down. We find some of our first systems advocacy occurring again with American Sign Language and Braille. You all have heard of those communication systems. The problem was that the authorities, people in control, were saying, okay, you people who are blind and can't hear, y'all use these communication skills in a particular way that really made no sense to the blind or the deaf. And those individuals stepped out at great risk and advocated for themselves, promoting a good, effective means of using both the American Sign Language and Braille. So we come on up to the 1950s and 60s, and of course through the early 1900s, much advocacy was occurring. Social Security came into existence to help individuals who were severely disabled gain a better quality of life. Of course, we know about the civil rights of 1964, and we know about the Architectural Barrier Act of 1968, and along comes the 1973 Rehab Act. Rehabilitation got started. But let me back up about 5,000 years, and there was a queen, Vishnu, out to battle, and this is documented through poetry. She was injured, lost her leg. She went back to camp by the help of her soldiers, strapped on a piece of iron onto her leg, went back to battle. So I think rehab might have started back then. Okay. And then came 1990. A great deal of advocacy occurred in the 70s and 80s leading up to 1990. And of course, throughout this timeline I've presented, men and women with disabilities fighting for one another, men and women without disabilities fighting for our country. We have all fought for our freedoms, and we will continue to fight for our freedom.
Amen.
Yeah, charge. We will. We can. We're here today, and we'll be back next year. At this time, I'd please like to ask you all to take a moment of silence in remembrance of men and women who have gone before us, both in defense of our nation's freedom as well as defense of our freedoms where disabilities are concerned. We have the right, men and women die for our rights to exercise our freedoms through voting. So if we can for a minute. Thank you all very much. And Miss Pamela, you may proceed.
There was a lawyer once, his name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the National Anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game. We stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners and the British had prisoners. And the American government initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners. They said, we want to send a man out to discuss this with you. They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, we want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange. On the appointed day, in a rowboat, he went out to this boat and he negotiated with the British officials. And they reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful, went down below in the boats, and what he found was a cargo hold full of humanity, men. And he said, men, I've got news for you tonight. You're free. He said, tonight I have negotiated